just trying to juggle a phone and a beer and a microphone.
Sorry, man.
Let's see. So, I'm gonna play the album. This is the first track on the album, and what I'm gonna do. The plan today seems to be playing the album, explaining where it came from, what it's about, and taking some questions. And then we also have a couple of collaborators here. Aneek somewhere. Aneek Thaper is here. There he is. And Richard Burki, also, who worked on the Atmos mix, is here. So I'll at some point get you guys to come and have a chat as well. So also I'm playing off, this is the strangest gig because I'm playing a gig off my phone. And we had it on site like do not disturb, and then Aneek phoned a minute ago, you might have heard it stopping. That was when Aneek arrived and said, oh, I'm here, I'm here. And the music stopped, so the guys, they were like, oh no, this isn't gonna work. But so anyway, if it stops, someone maybe is phoning, and maybe we can answer, and maybe they'll come through as well, and we can have a little chat with whoever's phoning up. So let's see how it goes. Sorry, I'm ruining this ambient track with my chat. So this is the title track. This is called On Being, with the viola player, Felix Gerbelo. So yeah, this album came from a database of quotes, which I've been collecting for the last 3 years or so. So I asked people on the website, maybe some of you actually submitted quotes that are part of this project. I asked people, what do you want to express that you feel you can't in everyday life? And it was, you know, with this note, we're going to make some sort of art project out of this. We don't know exactly what. And I didn't expect too much to come from it, but then when I actually left this thing for a few months on the website from the previous album, and went to this collection of quotes with, you know, following this question, I was really struck by how much beautiful, sort of, some of it's terrifying, some of it's hilarious, sort of mundane things, horrific things, just love and hate, and this full range of sort of human emotion and really honest, a really beautiful sort of honest representation of people's mindsets. People were being really open. I mean, mainly anonymously. There were some people that left their contact details, and actually, you know, May Casper, for example, became one of the co-writers on one of the songs in the album because she left her name with its poem, and then the vocalist Tawaya used the poem for the lyrics. So, you know, she became an official sort of songwriter with myself and Tawaya. I'll play that one later as well. So, but most of the quotes were left anonymously. And when I first read them, I was just struck by how sort of honest and beautiful and powerful this whole collection of ideas and thoughts were. And so the challenge then was, what should I do with all this stuff that's been, you know, we've collected all these ideas and these thoughts, with the idea, you know, suggesting to people that we'll make some art from it. But I wasn't prepared for how powerful a collection it would be. So I set about for the last, you know, 2-3 years trying to do justice to what people had submitted, really, and the best I could do was to make an album and try and, you know, pick quotes that I could turn into pieces of music, and visual collaborations as well. And there's also an installation. So I don't know if any of you guys saw that. There was in Oxford Street. We had it in W1 running for a few weeks recently. It's now in Miami, but there's an installation running in parallel to the album with Ksavere Computery, the Polish artist, who's made a beautiful sort of real-time visualization of all the quotes. So you can walk around inside this big sea of ideas and quotes, and then it plays the music in spatial audio, synced to the quotes. So you get to upload your own thoughts to become part of the process, you know, in real time as well. So there's two parts to it. There's the install, which is running as well, the On Being install, and then there's the On Being album, where I've spent, you know, the last few years with these couple of thousand quotes, and gone through them all and tried to find, you know, what can I turn, which quotes can I turn into a piece of music? You know, can I figure out some link between musical structures and musical ideas and any of the particular quotes? So the titles on the album are pretty bizarre things. You know, there's I am sitting in a church in Gravesend, listening to vinyl and drinking coffee, or you couldn't love me enough and I've spent my whole life making up for it. You know, sort of really, yeah. like stuff like that. When I read it, I was like, fuck, this is, you know, it was okay. That there's a lot of really intense things in there. There's really mundane, beautiful things. There's a whole range of really beautiful human expression that I was lucky enough to get access to through this question that we'd asked, and through all the people that got involved submitting their thoughts, which has led to this. So that's the idea. That first track was called On Being. It's a sort of summary. It's a sort of I guess it's a bittersweet summary of the collection as a whole. The second track is I've got the quotes written down here as well somewhere, so I can read the full quotes. The second quote that becomes the second track on the album was, "Life is meaningless, nothing matters, peace exists here, and yet the world is never ending. I cannot catch my breath. Stress comes from the deadlines that we place on ourselves." So a bit of a rambling sort of thing, but I was really interested in this peace exists here, this little sort of island of peace, and sort of I turned to my, you know, the album starts off fairly, you know, it starts off very eases you in. The really brutal quotes come later, and the brutal music as well. So that's the second quote, and I wanted to make a little island of peace with my favourite synth. You'll recognise the synth, probably, everyone. So maybe I'll play a bit without ruining it by chatting, and then we'll come back and have a chat again, and then we can do some questions. Sorry, I'm going to rudely interrupt. Yeah, because the album, there's 13 tracks, and if we listen to all of them and chat as well, we're not going to get through it all night. So I'm just going to give a taster of some, and maybe I'll play some longer, but let's keep moving on. So the third one, I mentioned I am sitting in a church in Gravesend, drinking vinyl and listening to old vinyl and drinking coffee. Which was this sort of interesting, in amongst the more intense quotes and the sort of love stories and the sort of tales of, you know, triumph and woe and all the rest of it. There was this really, I don't know, there's something really earthy, sort of everyday. I was interested in presenting the everyday aspect as well. The project became a bit of a sort of like a snapshot of the, you know, the shared psyche, I suppose. And I was interested in presenting this sort of everyday experience as well, and I approached it musically by including the sound of myself walking in the forest, you know, like with my binaural mics, the sort of leaves crunching underfoot. And I was in Australia for shows, and my family are mostly in Australia. I was at my uncle's, and he's really into folk music, and he had this little folk guitar And I said, and I really enjoyed the sound of it. I said, "Oh, would you mind if I put my binaural mics in and spend a few minutes downstairs in your basement with this guitar?" He probably thought I was very strange, but I sat there and strummed, played some things, and just recorded it. And again, it had this sort of grounded earthiness to it. I'm not sure if that's very clear, but hopefully you'll hear what I mean. And it seemed to link to the quote for me. So some of the connection to finding musical connections to quotes was partly that intuitive, sort of emotionally driven process. Sometimes it was a bit more of a procedural work, but I'll explain, the different approaches as we go through. So I'll play a little bit of this. I am in a church in Gravesend, listening to old vinyl and drinking coffee. Whoops, there we go. So I'm playing it off Dropbox, and it goes back to where the last position was on Dropbox, so I'm probably going to get a few of those where it starts right in the middle somewhere. Yeah. But yeah, also Dylan Baston is a great creative coder who's based in LA, who makes amazing Max for Live devices, and that the whole piece of music was built from that this folk guitar, this sort of really miniature guitar, and the sort of walking in the forest sounds, and then the Dylan Baston's sort of I think it was called, what was the name of one of his devices, where you have like a spectral representation of time in the frequency bands, and you can draw patterns through it. So you sort of, as you draw through this picture, you get these sort of arpeggiated sequences coming from the guitar samples. So that was Pathways, that's the name of the device. Yeah, Dylan's great for any of you that like the music tech geekery. So the next quote, this is where the album starts to get going, I guess, in a bit more of a intense manner. The quote for this one was, I have a sense of getting closer to something. I have a sense of getting closer to something which my life depends on. I can sense it, but I cannot tell if I should be excited or terrified about what will happen. So it was a quote that had a very clear, for me, there was a very clear feeling of sort of apprehension and excitement, and this like, something's coming, and this, it was intense, and it was something that, this is one of my favorite pieces on the album, I think. I found a sort of chord sequence and a structure that just seemed to carry that excitement, and it was a really sort of engrossing piece to work on. So I'm going to play that. It's quite a long one, this one, but I might, let's see, maybe I'll let it play, because the best bit's at the end. So we're going to, let's play it. Oh great, we didn't actually started from the start as well. I feel like I need like one of the, like a DJ, when DJs pretend to DJ and actually don't do anything, but I can't even do that, if I could like have one of the filters, I could like, connection between the quote and where it led me musically. Aneek, are you ready? Well, the next track on the album is with Aneek here, so let's get Aneek on stage. Aneek Thaper. So, hey mate, how you doing? All right. So, yeah, the track with Aneek was started. We've been chatting about just having some fun with drums and your modular system. And actually the quote came much later. You know, we were playing around with names and then I eventually found this quote because the database is thousands of quotes. And sometimes I sort of started from the quote, and so in this example we actually made the guts of the track first and then found the quote to fit, and then commissioned the music video to fit that as well from the quote. So it went both ways. But yeah, we basically went to your studio and had a lot of fun making crazy industrial gnarly noises. Do you want to chat a little bit about what we did?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a really, really fun day. I think just the night before you came, I'd kind of set up the modular synth, which for those of you who don't know, it's a big hectic mess of cables that is completely unsightly, but also the most beautiful looking thing you could ever imagine. And I basically set up to do some really raucous kind of drum programming, but also with lots of heavy kind of effects and manipulation and stuff like that. Because I wanted something that would be essentially quite playable and quite fun for us to fuck around with. And then I think actually when you showed up, we started dragging in loads of drum loops and drum samples and running that through it as well. And augmenting that with some of the kind of drum synthesis stuff that's built into this machine. And it ended up just being a really fun day of sound design, essentially, which I think is quite a fun way to start. You know, you sort of start off building your colour palette, as you were, before you decide on what the painting's going to be. And then the sort of music kind of just revealed itself after a while.
Yeah.
You know, you took it away. We had a big session of recording lots of stuff. Essentially, it ended up as one stereo track of just chaos, basically. And then Max took it away, and being the genius that he is, was able to turn a stereo piece of mess into this glorious kaleidoscope of colours and industrial madness, basically.
Yeah.
And then I think we either didn't have a name for it, or it was called something like distorted drum sesh or something for ages. And we didn't have a name for the longest time, and he said we really need to come up with a name. And I think we had a placeholder name after that was based on a quote for a little bit, and then you sent over a couple more, and it was like, yeah, I exist inside this machine, because it just fit so perfectly. You know, machine and the industrial nature of the music.
And then it was Henning and Lederer, who's this brilliant artist. I'd done a project 10 years ago about sort of existing inside the capitalist machine, this project called Numb. I was like, well, it'd be great that this really fits to revisit the story of, you know, us inside the machine 10 years later. So it's this sort of, there's all the emojis and all the madness sort of happening.
And it was a while before Max added this, the track halfway through, for those of you that know it, the single came out in January, I think. There's a big shift in the middle of the track where these big emotional chords, something that Max does really, really well, that I love as well, come in, and it really changes the track quite sort of gloriously. And that elevates everything to another level, and it just became this wonderful masterpiece of glory, essentially.
So yeah, I'll put, if you want to chat a bit as well while we play it, we can do that. Also, Soundman, are we playing in stereo? Have we got the left and right? Good, yeah.
Big shout out to Martin, a sound guy. I've known him for about 15 years. He's a really good guy, and he's a fantastic engineer, and he also works for a band called Jungle, who aren't also English. So yeah, look at us go. So quite a lot of this is modular stuff with your kind of additions. Yeah.
us was jamming with like the input drums, and one of us was jamming with the processing of the drums. That was generally the two. So we were both playing at the same time to make this sort of crunched up mess.
Yeah, exactly. And to make it extra fun, we mapped a lot of sort of the sort of sound design fuckery parameters to a little joystick. So felt quite familiar, but taking us back to our gaming days, and that was quite fun. And here we go. What would you call this thing? Is it IDM? Is it jungle-y spin-off? Is
yeah, like half time, I guess. Half time.
One.
Like it's basically got, it's sort of like a drum and bass tempo, but then it has only half the number of beats.
Yeah, but also it's way too busy for drum and bass. It's kind of IDM, kind of jungle.
I don't know. Yeah. Genres are a bit of a nightmare.
What does the streaming services class it as? Just electronica?
Probably like dance. Dance that no one's gonna dance to.
Disco.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I remember the first time, I don't know if it was the premiere, but certainly the first time I heard it live was when you had your show at the Barbican last year. 2 dates back to back, mind you. Well done. And it sounded fucking huge. It was amazing. And then I also had it in Copenhagen last weekend. Last weekend? Yeah, last Saturday night or something. Also, it just sounded massive, and it's one of the tracks off the record that is probably the most hectic and the most kind of IDM.
And also, the mix is sort of wrong in a lot of ways. Like it's quite like mids oriented, like most like typical sort of drum and bass tracks. There's tons of lows and tons of highs, and the middle is quite scooped.
Yeah,
the drums in this are really MIDI.
Yeah,
so you get this sort of fucked up sounding, but. We went with it, but
it's much less like EDM kind of sounding in terms of its kind of tonal shape, and it's much more like kind of electronic music for home listening, I guess. It doesn't have all the mids sucked out of it, so it sounds really clean in a club. It actually sounds really full and really thick.
A bit much sometimes, but
Actually, I wish I'd heard it from out there.
But thank you.
My pleasure.
We should do it again. That was great. Thank you, Aneek. Tawaya, the amazing vocalist. I was writing an ambient track, and the concept I was working on was, the quote was, "My choices are not my own," connected to the previous one. And I wanted to tell a story in relation to the sort of barrage of information that we exist in, and the fact that we're getting pushed and pulled in all sorts of different directions all the time. And this quote sort of made me, it connected with that idea with me, and something that I find particularly just, a lot of this album is, it's commentary on sort of what it is to be human now, So this sort of barrage of what we should think, what we should value, how we should perceive, and what's right and wrong, and all, we're constantly getting pushed around, and it's a bit of a head fuck. So I wanted to make a piece about it, and I had this quite sort of somber chord progression, and Tawaya, I said, do you want to work on this? And she was up for it. And she went to, I sent her the database of quotes as well, and then she turned to this this poem submitted by May Casper, who became a co-writer on the piece. And actually, when Tawaya sent back her vocals, it just made me feel, there was just this vibe, this sort of like old rave junglist vibe, and I basically had this 112 BPM track, and I was like, no, this has to, I basically added a third onto it and pushed it up to like 168 or something, which was the third extra, and then sort of put a jungle beat over it, so you get this interesting, sort of, the gridding of it is slightly unusual, but gives the kick an unusual sort of pattern. But it worked because of Tawaya's vocals, so it was another example of how collaboration sort of pushed it all in a nice new direction. So yeah, let's play it. This one, and the start is like this. I wanted to have this idea of all these different influences, so there's lots of voices, and in the Atmos mix, which Richard Burki did, who's here, he's going to tell about it soon. We have all the voices in different positions around you, so I'll talk about that a bit as well.
Your last speech chose a different language and shook me. So what is it that connects us? My tears, my fears, nothing like
The fade out on the phone. So yeah, let's move ahead because otherwise we're going to run out of time. The Sun in a Box, that one I heard was playing a few times, or I heard it playing while we were waiting. So and it's basically, the quote was, "I want to hold this on in a box." And again, it was more of one of the playful quotes where I was like, okay, I can have some fun with this. I was thinking, you know, when you open the box, the sun, all the brightness comes bursting out. So the whole piece is based on these like sort of builds towards this point where it suddenly explodes out. And also the idea of it, I was thinking of like sort of sunrise festival vibes. Like it's like an 11-minute sort of noodling synth, sort of loads of improvised synths on there, and that all came from this, you know, from this nice quote that was on there. I won't play the whole thing because it's like 11 minutes, and we haven't got much time. But I'll just reference it so you can hear what I'm talking about, and then I'll skip on. So here we go. Of that like 1-bar loop, and then there's about 200 layers of sounds. I spent a couple of years on that one. It was really a long process, and then just developed through lots of different phases. I'll play a little bit more of this bit as it's building towards the box sort of opening. If you needed. True Under Certain Conditions, that was like a fun, there was this quote in there that was more like, a lot of the quotes were really emotive and sort of these raw sort of feelings. There was this one that was true under certain conditions that I just appealed to me for, I guess, a rigid, it made me think I could do a really rigid techno sort of structure. I was interested in sort of the idea of truth defining algorithms, and also the sort of the degradation of truth, or, you know, in modern society and media, and having this track that was based on the word true, but then the word true would get mangled up, so it would become untrue and all distorted, and then every so often it would reform into the word true, and the techno track would be this really rigid sort of logical structure, but where you could shift one, you know, basically you've got the kick and you've got a hat and you've got a snare and you've got a bass line. There's like 4 really key, like ultimately simplified techno structure, and you could shift one of the elements relative to the other 3, and it would give the whole piece a very different sort of feeling. So the whole thing's constantly got these shifts in one or other element to sort of redefine the sort of truth status. That was the idea anyway. So I'll play a little bit of that. There. So I've got my voice, this is my mangled voice. It's my first sit-down mic rave event. you go. You get the idea. It'll be good whenever it's in in a club and whatever. We're not sat down with a microphone. Yeah, sit down rave. Yeah, sit down microphone is the future for us old aging ravers. So Soundman, have you got a good like 60 hertz in this room? Does it respond okay to like 40 hertz, 50 hertz? Yeah, because so the next track I sort of broke the rules on the next. There's this quote. The quote was, "When I sit alone in my thoughts, full stop, I am crushed." So it was really. I was a really intense sort of like. I was like, okay, it needs noise and confusion and Aho San. Aneek knows I'm a massive fan of Aho San, the French artist, and he does some beautiful noise work. And I got in touch with him immediately. The quote immediately made me think of him, so I got in touch and I was like, I'm doing this project, and there's this quote that's making me, do you want to collaborate on this? And he was up for it, which was great. So we've got his super mangled synths in there with loads of layers of distortion, and it was very much like a sort of emotional interpretation of the idea, and then just layering, and then I sort of broke the rules by completely over compressing. Like with compression, you're the sort of anyone that makes music are like, oh no, you don't want to. If you compress too hard, you destroy the music. But that, I went for that, like, okay, what happens if we really destroy it? We can get this. Actually, it was Aneek. I'd heard this thing in a Aho San track, and I was like, how does that work, Aneek? And he's like, I think you're just overdriving the limiter. And I was like, really? And then, and then I tried it, and I was like, oh yeah. So Aneek has an input on this, and I just took this 60 hertz, LFO on the bass line, and just pushed that 60 hertz so hard that it totally destroyed the mix. Everything else gets sucked out of the mix. So you get this, if there's a good frequency response in here, and we should turn it as large as we can, then you'll get the effect. It's sort of fun. Maybe I'll skip forward a little bit because it's anyone that you'll hear what I'm talking about. It'll when it starts wobbling your insides. I'm going to skip forward a little bit because Yeah. So there was, I mean, that was one of the most brutal pieces of music I've made so far, I'd say, because of and that was one of the interesting, or the quote had so much emotion and power in it that it pushed me into these things I wouldn't have done otherwise, and that was one of the really rewarding things of working with these quotes. But and also, there's an element of it being a terrifying quote and unpleasant listening experience as well. But I also think there's a lot of a therapeutic aspect to this sort of this process. Some of the quotes were troubled, particularly one of the later ones when it's more sensitive, and the music in a sense is trying to be cathartic as well as representing the quotes, so it's supposed to help. It's supposed to be a positive thing for reflection and for sort of exorcism, and something useful. That's the hope anyway. I hope you can hear some of that in there, along with the intensity and the aggression. So the next quote was one I mentioned at the start, another one of the messed up ones. This is the part of the album where we're getting all the twisted stuff. You couldn't love me enough, and I've spent my whole life making up for it. With Niels Arends, the great Belgian artist who worked on the Atmos mix on the previous album. We just the quote, the sort of communication of the quote came through quite a lot in the structure. We had this. The process was very different with Niels. All the collaborators I worked with was in a very different type of way. With Niels, we were sort of toying with this melody for sort of half a day or a whole day, just bouncing it. He'd have a go. I'd go away. I'd come back, and we'd have the quote in mind, and we were constantly going back and forth, tweaking away at this melodic form. And then once we had that, started building the layers of tension and this sort of, there's sort of beauty in the quote, but there's a lot of twisted sort of development, and then hopefully it comes through in the piece of music. And I think I'm going to skip it forward because we haven't got a lot of time. So I'm going to skip. That's another where Aneek can say what genre is that. I don't know. Yeah, let's bring Richard Burki on. Richard Burki from Amsterdam, from Future Phonic Studios, who worked on the Atmos mix. I don't know if you guys are into the whole spatial audio thing. So the challenge was taking each quote and each piece of music and each story behind each quote, and how do we build a spatial, three-dimensional version of each piece of music where you build it in a 3D model basically, and you sort of make all the interacting parts. It's like you're building a little three-dimensional organism with all the parts moving around in a coherent manner. It will then map to however many speakers happen to be in the room. The next piece of music is one that was interesting in that sense. Well, that's why I thought it'd be good to bring you on board now. But for example, the quote was, this was actually one of the more challenging ones, that you had to recreate a lot of the synth parts to make it happen, didn't you? So my mind is slipping. The quote was, my mind is slipping. I was interested in the quote because, rather than it being, it had an emotional sort of idea behind it as well, but there was an interesting sort of more technical mapping where I was interested in this idea of like, if you have a bunch of notes in a chord and all the notes playing, there's say 5 notes playing, but over time, each note in the chord plays at a slightly different speed. So really slowly, the notes start to slip relative to one another. And then as the chord progression develops, what happens is you get this sort of emergent, the notes start falling over each other, you get these emergent rhythms. But I was also interested in how you could further tell that story, that the Atmos mix could really enhance that story by not just having those different slipping notes rhythmically related, but you could have them spatially related. So each note is in a specific position around the room. And at the start, they all play together, but then as they start to slip relative to one another, you get emergent patterns. So it's like you can hear jumping around the space in different patterns because of the slipping. And it was a real pain in the ass to make it. And then it was also a real pain in the ass to do the Atmos mix. It was the last one, and it was a real pain in the ass to mix, and it was a bit of a nightmare throughout. But we did it anyway because we had to do it.
I think we got there in the end. Well, first off, when Max sends me his sessions, I get like a minor heart attack to begin with, because I don't know if you guys know, but they're massive. And when you first told me about this idea for My Mind is Slipping, I was like, sounds great, but then I opened the session and I actually saw the MIDI file, which is where you sequence all the notes. And I was like, God, what have I gotten myself into? So after, stressing for a couple of days, I sat down in the studio and we basically re-recorded a bunch of the synth lines you'd done, but we had to split every single note for every chord and arrange those spatially so that they would kind of create these emerging forms as the chords would evolve as well, which was a lot of fun. I'm kind of glad we were finished with it.
Yeah. But Richard did an amazing job. We had we'll do a screening, because at the moment all the visual projects are sort of ongoing. There's I haven't spoken about that, but every piece of music has a visual collaborator based on the same stories and the quotes, and we'll end up with we'll do a sort of full movie screening in Atmos at the Dolby Soho theatre at some point, probably later in the year. So you'll get to, if you're interested in hearing that stuff but don't have that way of hearing it, then we'll be keep a lookout. We'll definitely do some screening events and hopefully some more at LISA, the L Acoustics showroom as well, which sounds great. So yeah, there's opportunities to hear that stuff. Do you want to say anything more about the Atmos mixing? I mean, you can chat while I play it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is, if you guys haven't heard his music in spatial or in immersive, then do yourselves a favor and go to the screening. I think Max is one of the few artists whose ideas kind of get limited and confined by the world of stereo. So the immersive experience is, well, at least I think my closest approximation of what I think is going on inside of his head.
Yeah, I mean, I always hit a limit where I'm adding more and more layers, and it's not, you can't hear there's maybe 200 layers, but you can never hear 200 things. So but when you have lots of positions, you can have the same number, in each position, but then you can have lots of different positions for things, so you can increase the density of the layers. So it definitely lends itself.
A lot more real estate to work with, basically.
So this was the slightly maddening, my mind is slipping, where they start slipping. And it sort of drove us mad as well, fittingly. You get the idea. Then I mean, this is near the end of the album now. I mean, I sort of wound it down. There was one track. There was this quote that was in the database that I really didn't know if I should include or I could include. The name of the track is "Mother Nature Must Have a Different Plan for Me," but actually the full quote was, "I yearn for a child. Mother Nature must have a different plan for me," and it was such a poignant thing for someone to have submitted. I really didn't want to set out to make a piece of music. It was one of those ones where I was like, maybe something will come, maybe it won't. If it feels right, then maybe and something did come. It was a project with Tom VR, who's a great artist, and we were just improvising, looking at quotes and improvising, and he just played this really beautiful sequence, and then it just felt like it captured some of it needed to be something reflective and something therapeutic and meditative, and not like a horrific, like it needed to be something hopeful, something helpful, I guess that was the aim, and it's very stripped back, and because of such a delicate idea, that the piece of music, it follows that really. So I'll just play a bit of that. Yeah. Yeah, so the track title is Mother Nature Must Have a Different Plan for me. Again, to be sensitive to the quote, I didn't feel comfortable having the full quote as the track title. I just wanted, so you guys get the backstory there, but it won't be presented in that way unless people sort of delve in further to read about it for, sensitivity reasons, I guess, and it just felt the thing to do. Then the last track on the album was the last thing I made, and I was trying to wrap it up. I wanted to wrap it up on a sort of positive note, and then there was this quote, I have the feeling that something is missing, but I don't know what it is. And I used that as a sort of, to make the missing piece to sort of finish the album. That was the missing piece track, which is, it finishes on a more positive sort of rounding off note. And then I'll just hit play on that, and then we can also take some questions, I think. I'll just keep that going really quietly in the background, because I don't want to run totally out of time. Is there any questions? Like, maybe we could will this mic reach you guys? Soundman? No, apparently the mic won't reach. So either you can shout out, I can point. Does anyone have a question? Do you want to shout out? I can see someone at the back there. Hello.
So you collected people's thoughts and emotions, which is a really organic way to collect data. But you make songs with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I'm going to take the liberty of assuming that you have, that you think like a storyteller. Did a narrative emerge, or some kind of red thread that stitched together random human experience? And if so, how much of that narrative do you think as a band as its source, or how much is reflective of your mindset when writing the album?
So did a narrative emerge from the quotes? I'm turning, there's a sort of state of mind that someone's in, or some thought process, and then I'm turning it into a piece of music with a sort of start and a middle and an end. There's a sort of narrative structure, so I'm having to build a story from these thoughts. Certainly, I mean, I spent a couple of years with the quotes experiment. There was many quotes that I tried to make pieces of music that didn't work out, that didn't feel right. I think the overall story that happened for me, at least personally, working on this, was this really interesting thing where usually I make music and sort of put feelings and ideas into it, and I sort of trying to communicate it to the listener. And what I was finding, what I hadn't expected when I started collecting these quotes, was that all these feelings and ideas were coming back to me from the people that had been listening to the previous album, and it felt like much more of a two-way conversation. It was a really interesting way to work. So the narrative for me as a whole was that sort of conversational, feeling like I was in a very personalized conversation with people. And the thing is that nearly all of them are anonymous. There was only 2 of the quotes on the record, one that was on vinyl only, and then the one by May Casper. There was the vinyl only person wanted to be credited as New Age Punk, which, as it says on the back of the record in the shop here. But most of them were anonymous. So I'm really interested that, if any of you did submit quotes, or anyone, I'd love to hear from anyone that did submit words, because I've been spending my last few years with these ideas, not knowing who the conversations are with. But anyway, so I think that was the overall narrative of the project for me, was this sort of conversational, feeling very more. It was interesting that of the quotes, the 2,000 or so quotes, I hardly had to remove any, there was hardly any sort of, really nasty stuff in there, or it was really amazing how heartfelt and direct and honest all of these submissions were. So that really had a big impact on me. I wasn't expecting that, if you, from all our online interaction these days, you don't expect, you wouldn't expect it to be like that, but it was hardly needed to be removed much. And then as for narratives in terms of, individual pieces, it depends. Some of them, A Sense of Getting Closer is one of my favorite ones on there, and that has there is, literally the quote contains a narrative in it. So I was just trying to deliver my interpretation. And for the most part, throughout the record, it was that intuitive approach to making music. It's funny when, narrative in music is to do with arrangement and dynamics. And it's something that people often ask me about. How do you approach narrative, or the dynamics and the arrangement? And honestly, I find it hard to answer the question because I approach it without really thinking about it. I literally get in the studio and I've got the idea and I just play, and I just be like, I just play, and then when I feel like it needs a change, I'll just go with that. And it's done very mindlessly, in a sense, very just what feels right. And that's why I end up with the song in a box that was 11 minutes long, and and then my manager goes, but we can't put that on the radio, what are we going to do? And I was like, well, yeah, but it felt right. So so the narratives emerge quite naturally as well, without too much thought.
Would you do it again, Max?
Would I do it again?
Yeah.
What, this process of gathering quotes?
It's a rhetorical question.
It was, I don't know how to answer it. Is there any non-rhetorical questions in the audience? I can see a hand up there. The lady there, yeah.
Lady there, listening.
Yes, sorry.
Sure. Max, you said that one of the tracks that you played tonight took you 2 years to complete. How do you know when it's done?
Right.
When you listen to it now?
Yeah, the song in the box. That's the 11-minute one, and it's not done now, so it's not done. It was really annoying. Like, I could have worked on that for another year or 6 months, certainly. There was loads of things I wanted to do, but in the end, again, like, gigs get booked in, and we're like, okay, the gig's coming, we need an album. Which is a good thing in a sense, because it forces me to finish things, because otherwise you can be in this endless... It's really hard to finish things, like, especially when you start. There's the initial phase of making music where there's just the quotes and the feelings and the ideas, and it's all, I'm just delving in and not worrying about whether it's good or not, and just expressing really freely, and putting ideas down. And then there's the much more painful part that comes later, when you have to decide, is something actually good or bad, or do you want to put it out into the public? And at that point, things become much more complicated and difficult, because you also lose, particularly after working on that piece of music for 2 years or so, you lose objectivity when you hear it. All you hear is, there's a frequency that I needed to tweak there, and there's this particular tiny click sound which I think maybe needs to be here, and it's not quite right. And you've got all these in-depth thought processes, and you don't hear just what it sounds like. So it's really hard to know if it's done. So it's actually quite handy having deadlines and just being, okay, I'm just going to work on it as hard as I can. I've got, the 2-year deadline's up, and I'd love to keep working on it, but I have to move on to other things, because it's my job to make music and do gigs, and the rest of it's like, I have to pay the bills, we all have to. So those practicalities come in, which maybe is useful, but also I'd love to do a project where I could just work on it for 10 years and just not, and just see, I don't know what would happen. But also I think there's a risk of driving yourself mad with that sort of thing, because you can, anyone that writes music, you'll know that you can constantly second guess yourself, and you lose objectivity, and it becomes this real headfuck of a thing. But anyway, sorry, that was a very rambling answer.
Maybe on a side note, just because I'm feeling like a bit of a third wheel here. What's it called? When Max sent me his sessions, there's a bunch of stuff in the sides of those sessions that's really amazing that never got released, but maybe someday.
Yeah, there's a lot of crap stuff as well. But do you want to talk about the Atmos mix at all anymore? It's a shame we can't play people until you can explain it a little bit more, but...
Yeah, I think, if you haven't experienced what Atmos is, or immersive or spatial audio for that matter, it's basically, if you think of stereo as a two-dimensional audio experience, Atmos is a three-dimensional audio experience. And I think Max has been thinking three-dimensionally since quite a while. especially if you've been to his shows. You know, the visuals, the music, they're all symbiotic. It's one experience, really. And I think that's also kind of how you're visualizing things when you create them. But to be honest, I think Max's Atmos mixes were some of the weirdest Atmos mixes I worked on, in a great way. In the sense that first, well, like I said, when he sent me his sessions, they're like 200-300 tracks, and that's the smaller ones, which kind of stressed me out for a while. But I think we really had kind of like a breakthrough moment when I finally got to meet or visit Max's studio here in London, and I noticed in the corner of his studio he has this massive print of a Jackson Pollock painting, and I'd been struggling to kind of comprehend his music in stereo, at least to a certain extent. So I asked him what that painting was all about, and he told me that that's actually a big inspiration for his sound and how he shapes his music and the image he has in his mind as well when he's crafting for what we're doing in Atmos. So the idea, I know if you guys are familiar with like the splatter paintings that Pollock did with all the colors, but it kind of seems like this chaotic mess which you can really get lost in, and you can just start to explore different corners and different bits and discover new sounds. And oh, in his case, sorry, I got into the music again. And I think that was kind of the idea with how we wanted to approach the Atmos version. So most Atmos mixes you'll hear kind of sound like a bit of a stereo plus situation, where everything's still very stereo and you might have a few cool elements whizzing out and around you, or, you know, Elton John's guitars flying around your head, which is a bit weird. But in Max's case, it made a lot more sense, and I think that he's one of the first artists that's really kind of exploring that medium and what it means to actually create music for that medium as well. So yeah, you'd be doing yourself a disservice if you
also, yeah,
stick to the stereos.
The Pollock thing, yeah, that's more of a long-term goal. Like I like the idea of there's that sort of beautiful combination of order and disorder, and sort of the fractal line structure and just the chaos, the sort of almost like meaningless chaos, but in this beautiful structure. It's something that I've been trying to achieve musically for a long time, but haven't quite got there. But there's this. It's a long-term goal, I think, to try and get to that position. But certainly the way I make music is quite like that process of throwing, during the free expression part, I do a lot of layers of improvisation where I try not to restrict myself and try and just throw as many things as possible and not worry whether they're good or not, and just try and free express and try and get the emotion. And then later on worry about, then you spend the years and months sort of just taking away all the tiny bits and slowly. It's almost like sculpting music rather than writing music like a composer. I'm going to play a song and play it. It's like I'm just going to make a huge mess of emotion, and then I'm going to slowly chip away all the bits that I don't want, and then try and shape it and then be left with something that I do want. As it's like an inverted creative process.
And that somehow makes sense as well, which is, well, there's a lot of bits, first of all. And I think in Immersive it was interesting because it kind of translates into this. Well, Max has an interesting way of writing, where he writes deceptively simple dance music in a sense on the bottom. That's kind of the pulse of the whole thing, but everything that happens on top is like its own narrative. It's a secondary story that kind of unfolds. And I think that's where things really get interesting, especially in well, if you experience it in Immersive, it's kind of like this digital jazz of sound design that's just happening. And I have no clue how he does it, but
yeah, I mean that's the challenge of making music that needs to function in venues where maybe the sound isn't, you don't have the fidelity, or on it needs to function on a phone speaker, or
and unfortunately not all venues are immersive yet. So
yeah, so it's that challenge of how to get all the detailing in there and the layers. But there were some more questions before I can. Yeah, there's a guy there with the cap and the hand up.
A lot of your music's quite ambient, or most of it, but occasionally a track like Swapped just pops out. What kind of creates that? Like, is it a pressure cooker for you, or what's the kind of process? Because that's like really more rigid than like the rest of your music.
Yeah, and there was that one really rigid techno track on this as well, the True Under Certain Conditions. Yeah, it's difficult. I love all sorts of different music, and I used to release on techno labels, and there was always this thing about, okay, if you're gonna, we were talking about the genre a little bit when Aneek said what genre is it. There's this thing about music where we want it to fit in a box. That person makes that genre and that does that, and that's always the pressure that the music industry sort of wants to say, what do you do? And okay, you go to this label and you do this thing. And that was one of the reasons I started the Mesh label project, because I was feeling like, why can't I make I love rigid techno, but I also love organic ambient music, and I love sort of glitchy drum and bass, and I love sort of melodic house music and vocal experiments, whatever. I love all these things, and if depending on what my mood is, I've always found that the best results came when, if I'm feeling a certain way, or in this case where I'm contending with a quote that's really connecting with me and making me feel a certain way, to just express that directly without worrying about what the genre or the BPM or the structure is, and trying to be free. And yeah, the techno stuff just comes from, I went to Nottingham Uni and we ran this techno party. A good friend, Satyajit Das, who I often work with, from Architecture Social Club, he ran this techno night called Firefly, and that was something I got involved with and was a resident at for 10 years or so. And I love that, that sort of form and the energy. And as I've gone on, I'm doing more sort of range of sort of arts-based projects and more expressive projects. I still feel there's something important. I just love the feeling of that raw, rigid, sort of boiled down structure, and we probably, everyone in here, I'm sure I don't need to say why. It's just something very visceral and enjoyable. So yeah, I don't know. It's just something I want to do. So it happens, and I try not to restrict myself. But I'm not sure if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's the truth. Any more questions? Someone, maybe not. Oh yeah, I can see. Yeah, another guy with a cap there.
How have you found your creative process and journey from, say, when you started 10 years ago to where you are now?
The creative journey, difficult. I think one of the important things with all this stuff is, like, it's very easy for it to, when you hear the finished thing, and you see people, presenting their work online or doing shows. You always see the end product, and maybe you don't see all the challenges, the difficulty. It's always been really hard. Like, particularly at the beginning, it was really difficult to, like, just make music that seemed that people liked, or that I liked, or it's felt like it wasn't impossible to do. So there was a lot of struggle and a lot of sweat, and just keeping on. But luckily, I've all the way through, I've just tried to focus on, because I love making music. I think for me, actually, this album relates to my own position as well, in the sense that if I'm having difficult internal thoughts, or if I'm having a hard time, music is the way that I can sort of extract that out and express it, and the catharsis happens via music. So I guess that's part of the reason why I've always written so much music. But look, yeah, it was difficult, but there was lots of enjoyable moments, and sort of it always felt therapeutic to make music. And if I was in that sort of intense aggressive mood, then it needed to be an intense aggressive piece of music. And if I was in a sad sort of mood where I needed some hope and reflection, it needed to reflect that. So I think this album also was interesting, because I was getting these same things back, which were very familiar, which I could then reflect back again. Yeah. Any more questions? Oh yeah, Sam, is it? Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. This album feels really it's really thematic. It's long, kind of a singular idea. So I think you're getting a phone call. Is that you?
No.
How much of it is a departure from previous stuff? So I know that previously you've had different themes in music and that kind of thing, but this album feels much more kind of singular in its focus. And I know you've used similar samples and similar synths from previous work, but has the singular focus on this album made the music that you made a lot different to previous?
Yeah, I think the main thing from my point of view at least was just the sort of raw, visceral nature of the quotes led me to make the more. It seemed to push the music to more extremes than I think on previous records. I was, like you're saying, I was still using a lot of the same toolkit. My favorite go-to synths and sounds and techniques, but the quotes were so. I mean, they're crazy. Like that collection of quotes is so intense to read, especially when you sit and read one after the other. It was a really extreme emotional sort of weight involved, and that I think that's what then came through in the record, which I think probably makes it maybe it makes it more difficult at points to listen to, but hopefully more beautiful at points as well, or more meaningful. Yeah. Any more final questions before we have to go on the front here?
I was wondering if the role of collaboration has changed in your creative process over time. We're just interested in that because it seemed like a very important thing.
Yeah, there were quite a few collaborations. Yeah, absolutely. Tawai and Aneek, Richard, absolutely, and Aho-san, Niels. Yeah, I think over time, making electronic music particularly is always a very solitary thing, and over time, I think even more so than just the musical collaborations, like it's the visual collaborations that I really value. I mean, obviously I value both, but I just mean the visual collaborations are something that I do a lot of. There are quite a few, musical collaborations in this album, but then there's 13 visual collaborations, which we haven't even spoken about. And over the past, 10 years or so, I've got really into this process of working with visual artists or with scientists or architects or, people from outside of music. Just because, the solitary process of making music it's great, but we need, having human interaction is really important. And the process of collaboration has pushed me in, there's so many things I've done musically that I couldn't have found if it wasn't for those collaborations. There's a lot of projects where, like Repetition, the one I did with Kevin McLaughlin, that was a totally different piece of music when he sent me the video, and I was like, oh wow, okay, no, it needs to be like this. So there's so many things that have come musically from the process of, from those processes of collaboration, and the same goes for the musical content on this album. So yeah, I've definitely become more and more dependent. I don't know if dependent's the right word, but more and more into collaboration for creative reasons and personal reasons, and just making the whole thing more enjoyable and rewarding. So yeah, it's definitely something I appreciate. But then on the flip side, I also really appreciate there is still most of the time is still solitary. But I guess it's just not having all the time solitary. And again, that was another reason why I was interested in this album, because it does have it felt like a collaboration with the people that had been listening to the previous album in terms of the approach. So yeah, I think, ultimately making music is about sharing the human experience and communicating with each other. So having that as part of the process is important. Any last questions? Yeah, one more there.
When you make these pieces of music, do you have an image or idea how people should listen to them? Is it a club, part of your TV shows?
Yeah, how do people listen? I try my best to make the music compatible to as many different listening environments as possible. I think the optimal listening environment is the studio that it's made in, whether that's the stereo mix in the studio that was made in, or the Atmos mix in the studio that was made in. those are the sort of, I'm optimizing for wherever I'm sitting in that moment generally. But there's a lot of thought and a lot of work that goes into trying to make it sound okay in here or on a phone speaker or in a venue. And that's one of the really difficult things about making music. And also it's a trade-off. You can make it sound really good. If you want to make something sound really good in a club, you make the kick drum really loud, you make the snare drum really loud, you make the hi-hat really loud, and then everyone can dance to that, and that's great. But if you then listen to that on headphones at home or on your home system, then the melodies and everything else is much more lost in there. So then you can go, okay, I'm going to make the melodies louder, and I'm going to make the chords louder, and the sort of bass harmonies louder. But then you play it in a club and it doesn't sound good. So there's many years and a lot of toil. That's one of the main stresses, actually. The really hard things about trying to finish pieces of music is that, like, I think I've got the balance right, and then you test it in a venue and it sounds crap, and then you tweak it and you test it in another venue and it sounds crap for a different reason, and then you test it in someone's car and it sounds crap, and you test it in your phone and it sounds crap, and there's this, you're endlessly and in the end you sort of have to go, okay, I'm going to just accept that this isn't going to sound perfect everywhere, and I accept that you've done your due diligence. You've done it the best you can. Again, it's always that thing. It's like we mentioned earlier about this sort of situation where, in the end, you just have to draw a line under it and sort of move on. And the album is full of things already that even the listening session today, I was like, oh god, there's that frequency needs to be pulled out, and there's all these things that are wrong, but those things that are wrong in one space could give a lot of character in another space, depending on the acoustics and all this. So I've done my best to make it go across venues, and with the idea in mind that it should be listenable in any space, really. Any last questions? I guess we're probably running over time, but yeah, thank you very much, everyone. It was fun. First attempt. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Aneek. And thanks, Rosie. Label manager Rosie's here.